Good morning. We're honored to be here at DevFest Istanbul, one of the largest GDG DevFests in the world. I'm Carmen, and I'm on the lead on the open source team for the Go team at Google, based in New York.
And I'm Van Riper, and most of you probably don't know me, but I once was the person who ran the Google Developer Groups program. In fact, I was the first program manager for that program back in 2010. But today, so I have my GDG hat on, but today, I'm here for Go. And I also work with Carmen in the open source team, and I have a role similar to what I had back then where I was working with the Google Developer Group organizers, where I work primarily with the Go meetup organizers. I don't know if you know that there's a Go developer network, similar to the GDG Meetup Pro network. And right now, we're over 150 groups. We're close to 100,000 members, and we actually have a Go meetup here in Istanbul that hasn't been active, so we're looking for someone that would like to re-energize that group, and if we could get that group started again and have them join our Go Developer Network, they could be the ones that takes the Go Developer Network over 100,000 members, because we're currently just shy of that. So if there's anyone here that's is from Istanbul, would be interested in starting a Go meetup, please let us know. You can talk to Carmen or I afterwards.
Okay.
Are we good now?
Yeah, we're good. Do you want me to advance for you?
Okay. Let's go. Yeah, so it all kind of began just over 10 years ago when Rob Pike gave an internal talk, a Google Tech Talk, previewing the release of the language called Go. And it became official publicly on November 10th when we had the golang.org blog announcement on November 10th, 2019. And we're actually celebrating all the month of November. In fact, Carmen and I being here today is part of the celebration of Go turns 10. And if you go to look on social media, you'll see a lot of posts from our Go meetups around the world about Go turns 10. Yeah, so you're welcome to join in that. If you want to take a picture here and post about Go turns 10, that'd be great. So yes, so now we're here to reflect on the last 10 years of the development of Go since it was launched as a public source project. And we have three themes. I'm going to be talking about the foundations leading up to the work on Go, starting in 2007. And then Carmen's going to talk about reflections on the last 10 years, as well as predictions for the future. Oh, the places you'll go. we can't get enough of Go puns. So we're going to start with the foundations. Let's take a trip back in time and just humor us as programming historians. So it all started back in the late 1950s. Well, I didn't start, but where we're going to start is in the late 1950s, where language was tended to be tied to the hardware. So each hardware manufacturer would produce their own programming language. And this led to this Tower of Babel. And this is a book cover from that time about languages, the myth of languages. And so moving back into the 60s, right? So there was a seminal moment in January of 1960 where 13 computer scientists met in Paris to actually design and create this language called Algol. And it has become the foundation for all of these languages. In fact, the influence is undeniable of Algol. Actually, funny side story, this may be dating me. I didn't go to MIT in the 1960s, but when I did in the 70s, the first language that you were introduced to as part of the computer science curriculum was Algol, where they talked about the lexical scoping rules in Algol that are actually used still today in many languages. So. But yeah, there was many descendants that came from Algol, but basically all of the modern languages that we have all worked with have roots in Algol. So we have a lot to thank those 13 computer scientists for from 1960. So going into the 60s, beyond Algol, a really key concept that was developed was concurrency, starting in 1964. And actually, most people think of the Dijkstra paper from 1965 as actually the work of Douglas McElroy when he was at Bell Labs on Unix pipes, which is really the seminal work on concurrency that was 1 year earlier than that work. And I'm not going to ask you to read this or read the whole thing to you, but the key point here is what he was saying in this paper is we should have some ways of coupling programs like garden hose, screwing into one another's segment when it becomes necessary to massage data in another way. And this is the way of I/O also. So this idea that led to the channels and Go routines of today actually started from this work in 1964. I kind of jumped ahead on that, but that's okay. The next important point was in 1978 when Tony Hoare published a paper on what he called communicating sequential processes, or what we commonly refer to as CSP. And in his paper, he proposed a language with processes each running sequentially, communicating with each other, unbuffered through unbuffered channels. And CSP evolved over the next 2 decades with many branches here. And the newsqueak in particular's communication mechanisms are as found in CSP, with channels acting as rendezvous points for processes. And that was it Rob that actually worked? Yeah, Rob Pike, one of the creators of the Go language, actually worked on newsqueak, and we can see the influence of his time working in that language in the design of Go.
Great.
Yeah. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Carmen.
Great. So why do we need to learn history, and what does this all have to do with Go? I think you'll see in a moment. As we keep this newly learned history in mind, let's branch off for a very important 2 years in this journey, Go's creation, from 2007 to 2009. In 2007, during a 45-minute C++ build, Rob Pike, who was working at Google at the time, was doing some minor but central work on an enormous Google C++ program. We're talking multiple millions of lines. And compilations were taking 45 minutes on this huge distributed compile cluster. An announcement came around internally at Google that there was going to be a talk presented talking about what was coming in the newest version of C++, which was C++ 11 at the time. This is Rob's quote. In the span of an hour at that talk, we heard about something like 35 new features that were being planned. At this point, I asked myself a question. Did the C++ committee really believe that was wrong with C++ was that it didn't have enough features? Surely, it would be a greater achievement to simplify the language rather than add to it. And during this 45-minute compilation, Robert turns around in his chair, and sitting right behind him was Robert Griesemer, a computer scientist from ZTH in Zurich, Switzerland. The two of them started going back and forth for a few minutes, which turned into a full hour. And I'd like to imagine that the first conversation they had was like this famous XKCD compiling comic classic. And as they really started to dig in, they grab a colleague named Ken Thompson. Some of you may know who he is. He is the creator of Unix, which is in any Apple or iOS product that you have, but also in their Android products, because Linus Torvalds of Linux based Linux off of Ken's Unix. And so every device that we have in this room has Ken to thank for it. Now, remember the foundations of programming language lineage and concurrency that Van mentioned, ALGOL and CSP? They follow a trajectory like this. ALGOL evolves in 2 places. C-like languages evolve in the Americas, and Simula and Pascal evolve in Europe. And notable successors influencing Go include Smalltalk and Oberon. Over on the far left side, you see CSP evolving into newsqueak, and as Van mentioned, something that Rob Pike had written. Go represents the convergence of these lineages and schools of thought by the very people who either had it created or had a hand in creating these. We mentioned Rob Pike for newsqueak, but he also was Ken's colleague at the famous Bell Labs. And he iterated on 3 decades, ever since Tony Hoare's 1970 paper, on concurrency, and he finally gets it right with Go. In Robert Griesemer, he worked under the great Nicholas Wirth at ZTH. Nicholas Wirth is probably a founding father of computer science, and he took that language and whittled it down to a vector space. So as part of that, he already knew how to take an existing language and make it smaller. I return to ALGOL because I find the patterns that evolve in technological advances poetically similar. We have this ALGOL consolidation of that Tower of Babel of languages based on experiences of computer scientists in the advances of hardware. In Go, you have a similar consolidation of feature creep in the language proliferation. So this is our Tower of Babel 2.0. And within build languages and tool chains on experiences within computer scientists in the advances of hardware. So creation, proliferation, complexity, consolidation, this is the pattern that it takes. Programming by 2007 had become too complicated. The features had gone beyond the ability for the programmer to use all of them. And so Go is, the very reason for Go's design philosophy is to stave off that proliferation and complexity. One way that Go does that is by waiting for good design. As the saying goes, no is temporary, yes is forever. Go is very famous for when someone submits a pull request to contribute to the language, adding a feature. We're very famous for saying, nope, we don't want to add that to the language. And that has some downsides for feeling good to be a contributor, but it has an upside for Go as a language. I want to talk about the design philosophy as it goes against the grain of the vast majority of other open source projects. We have a growing bias towards action. On the very top here, if you've been using GitHub, you may recognize that as the green contribution graph. And many people will do any kind of code just so that they can get that green square. But what are we really incentivizing with green squares? What about the slow think? And what about all the no's that actually came to inform the yes? In an industry where ship fast and break things has become the norm, it is refreshing to have a programming language in Go not do this. And this has been critical to Go's success in the last decade. Whenever I think of Go, this Thomas Edison quote comes to mind. I never once failed at making a light bulb. I just found out 99 ways not to make one. Some versions have 10,000. So I've been asked, what is it that the Go team looks for when we wait? I've heard a teammate say, when there is a doubt, Go says no. And this flies in the face of other programming languages and other open source projects. But I don't think that what other languages do necessarily fits for Go. As a language with a compatibility promise, which I'll get to later, and one that our digital infrastructure is increasingly depending on, we simply cannot. I hope this gives you a good foundation about the creation and the design philosophy of Go. Now I'd like to reflect on what's happened over the last decade. As we reflect over the 10 years, I want to stitch together 3 timelines as we try to express them, because everything is interrelated. And I find this particularly fitting in Istanbul, where this place is an interrelated mix of history and culture, and that is your heritage. And I want to blend timelines in the same way. So this first timeline in the middle, I'll share notable moments of the language and tooling for Go. On the bottom, I'll share ecosystem, industry, or software development trends over the last 10 years. And in the top, I'll talk about cloud. Now keep in mind, this is not complete. This is just my recollection of some of the notable things that have shaped me and all of us in this room in the last decade, with Go and beyond. The first is GitHub. GitHub was formed the very same year that Golang went open source. And it's interesting to reflect how development has changed over that time. If you were a developer 10 years ago, more than likely you were not using GitHub. Almost everyone used something like SourceForge. And in fact, Go has had 4 version control systems over its history, in its short 10-year history. Google Code also was a thing that got shut down about 4 years ago because it was a competitor to GitHub. And the fact that Go switches to Git and mirrors it to GitHub has everything to do with the success of GitHub and where we as developers have been moving. And also how GitHub centered the experience around developers instead of users. So GitHub made social coding mainstream. And we can't reflect on the decade of development in open source without it. So at Google internally, it should be noted that Java and Android also uses Git instead of the internal version control system, also based, it's called Perforce. Some of you may know it. But every other Googler outside of Go and Android and other open source projects doesn't use Git, but everything else is Git when it's open source. And that's why I wanted to mention GitHub. The other thing that launched in late 2009 was Instagram. And this is truly the first killer mobile app that I remember in the new iPhone, Android era. And although Instagram is written in Python, I thought I'd mention it here because this choice has consequences at scale, as most of the higher level languages do. So Instagram makes it into my timeline because this article was written last month. I came across it. And I don't say this to insult Python, but only to say that every language has trade-offs. And what some may gain in dynamic typing may have to pay for down the road in workarounds when they reach scale. Now, every app isn't going to reach the resounding success of Instagram. But in hindsight, the lifetime of maintaining code is the true developer productivity. And I want our memories to not be so short. The creators of Go fundamentally understood this. They had decades of maintaining code and understood the patterns chosen that would age and scale well. There's so much to mention about Go's features, but I'll only mention the notable ones. Our notable addition and novel aspect about Go 10 years ago was this idea of Go fumped as a tool, and that is our canonical format enforcer. When this was released in 2009, people hated it. But now, more and more language ecosystems that are using automation to stop this tabs versus spaces argument. How many of you have been in a tabs versus spaces argument? Maybe? In Go, when you hit refresh on your editor, it just formats it for you. And so when someone says, do you prefer tabs or versus spaces, Gophers like to reply, go fumped yourself. But what's also interesting is any newer language, like Dart, developed after 2009, has now included a similar canonical format enforcer. So I'd like to, in another 10 years, I hope all language installations would have this baked in, because then we can tell our children about the good old days of pointless arguments, because tabs versus spaces is a pointless argument. The notable event in cloud in 2009, was Heroku coming on the scene to simplify deployment and production for devs. So it had this idea of a build pack. And if you were around in 10 years, you probably are saying, oh, yeah, it just was changing the game for people to put things into production. And the 12-factor app, you're going to hear a new take on a 12-factor something at this conference today, but the 12-factor app, which is a paper I would say go and read if you haven't, because it's a shared industry zeitgeist that every developer should read. That was also published by Heroku in these years, talking about their experience of scaling and operating at scale. Okay, who's in the Node.js ecosystem or JavaScript ecosystem? So an important thing happens in 2010, and that is Node launched NPM, the Node Package Manager. This makes a difference for all of our lives because the ease of use in which we can install and use libraries, all in the command line, it changed the face of developer velocity and expectations. It changed the game of software reuse, for better or worse. And NPM also starts a trend of developer tooling, which will continue to grow in the decade, and among the most successful tools are written in Go. On the language side, we added append, which was considered an omission in the original release, but it makes our arrays, our fixed-length arrays called slices, easier to work with. We also have something get added, which was GoFix in the language, another tool very similar and useful as GoFumped. And it's about automating, updating or refactoring your code using an automated fashion. So you can look for old versions of an API, and it will GoFix will rewrite them to the current API, and then write the program back to the file. So this is a premonition of Go and other languages adding fantastic tooling to the ecosystem to help developers. The other thing that happened was the first large Go app, Vitesse, which is to solve MyScale scalability challenges, was written in 2011 at YouTube. 2012 marked a big milestone, and that was release of Go 1.0 and the compatibility promise. So the compatibility promise is the first time that a language explicitly made this promise at the source level. And it was very different from what was going on with other languages. This compatibility promise really changed things. One thing I will say about a compatibility promise is that if you were to take code that someone wrote 10 years ago and tried to run it on your computer or a server elsewhere, I would ask the question, will it run? It most likely will not. And this is what Rob Pikes calls computational reproducibility. For Go, at least starting in 2012, we can guarantee that if you have a Go 1 program, even if it was written in 2012 or today, or as long as Go 1 exists, it will run on any machine that it is compiled for. Another thing that gained steam after this compatibility promise was containers and the container infrastructures in cloud. So containers are kernel primitives in the Linux kernel, also developed at Google in 2003. And this is starting to take edge at Linux distributions. So you'll see HashiCorp, which is an infrastructure corporation, write all their tools at Go. And also CoreOS, which was the first Linux distribution that did away with package managers like Yum and apt and just used containers to do everything. Next comes Docker. How many of you use Docker as a developer tool? So Docker is written in Go, and it was really Go's killer app in 2013. So this is the fastest uptake of a developer technology ever in the history of developer technology, going back this century and last, and it was written in Go. And all of this activity, these slopes that are going up, 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 is the number of contributors, which had reached almost 500 after the Go 1 compatibility promise within the next 12 months after that. And also we have around an estimated 300,000 worldwide users in the first 4 years. Let's talk about the next 5 years. So the first Go conference is really where it ignited a community. And that was in Denver, Colorado, and it happened in April 2014. Over the next 5 years, we would get Gopher conferences everywhere, and now we're starting with our very first GDG conference using Go. The next big milestone is Kubernetes. Who has used or heard of or has worked with or is Kubernetes adjacent? So Kubernetes was open sourced at Google in 2014, and it's written in Go. So this is the new middleware of the cloud, and the infrastructure and DevOps space has galvanized around it. And if you're working in cloud, all the cloud vendors have Kubernetes as a managed offering. And this form of compute, going from VMs to containers, has changed completely, a paradigm shift. And with this paradigm shift, we're going to need a bigger boat. This boat was the cloud-native computing foundation. This rectangle is the resulting explosion that followed. That rectangle is called the cloud-native landscape, and I've seen it grow exponentially over the last 4 years. As of 2009, 3/4 of all CNCF projects are written in Go. And I don't have stats pulled for the other non-graduated projects, but I would say over half of them are Go projects, probably more. This shows in less than 5 years, Go becomes the language of cloud and cloud native. Returning to language improvements these years, the compiler toolchain was completely rewritten, and the garbage collector was completely re-engineered. I'll talk about the significance of that later. But we also have Women Who Go, GoBridge, and other networks of communities growing, and a code of conduct. For language improvements, we have an important feature for distributed system, and that's the context package. And then garbage collection improvements went from milliseconds to almost microseconds in the 1.8 release in 2017. This is important for Go's readiness in the enterprise. Finally, last year, we published out our tech lead, Russ Cox, writes seminal papers, which I think they're going to age and they're going to be history for any computer science student going forward. But the Vigo papers would eventually become what we call modules. And this is the beginning of understanding the problem of code reuse and the complexities introduced by pulling down code easily from the internet, made easier by NPM and GitHub mentioned in the last timeline. For a more detailed look about this, Russ Cox published an article in the July 2019 issue of the ACMQ for the Security and Machine Learning what is it? Not episode. What's a magazine called? Issue. The issue. So the future of dependency management is needed for a secure digital infrastructure, and we all need to work this together, and Go is leading the charge. As far as our community, by the end of 2018, we have 1,600 contributors, an estimated 1 to 1.6 million users, and 19 Go conferences around the world. This year, we see the growth improve. Over a 30% increase in contributors, a 25% increase in users. We've probably crossed the 2 million mark, and our conferences have exploded. 2019 was so busy, we're going to go give it its own slide. So we have another tool that's just improving the tool chain, and that's called GoGet. And then our modules for dependency management went in as an experimental feature. In March, the Go Developer Network was formed.
Woo!
I'm going to let Van talk about that.
I did talk about this earlier when we were at our time check,
Yeah.
but I'll just underscore that, since this is a GDG event, you're all familiar with the Google Developer Groups program. Similar to that program, we have a Meetup Pro network called the Go Developer Network. And this is a snapshot of the recent statistics. So we're honing in on 100,000 members, and we'd love to work with you all. We have actually, why don't you guys stand up? We got a couple. Our only GDN Go Meetup organizers in the world are in the building from Izmir. Yeah. So, but I'd like to, if we come back next year for DevFest, to have a lot more people stand up that are doing Go Meetups. So if and there's actually a meetup here in Istanbul, but it doesn't seem to be active right now. So if you are part of that meetup or would like to help get that meetup activated again, we might be able to push this number of 100,000 if we could just get the Istanbul meetup restarted. So, yeah.
And this has all happened in the span of 8 months since Van started this in March. In May, we have an online browser tool to run your Go code called the Playground, and now it supports third-party packages or libraries. So library authors can now include Playground links to document their APIs, and they can also test without installing a library on their own machine. I talk about the latest release because it's our biggest release yet, and it takes Go modules in the entire tool chain, like the mirror, our index, and our sum check-based database, to productionize those within Google infrastructure. And the first 2 Go language changes land. So these are improved number literals and sign shifts. We are going to continue to look at go-to language changes for those of you that have, and we've gotten complaints, the thing that's holding many Java, C++, C# developers are generics. And those are in active development at TIP. And then this month, the launch of go.dev. So go.dev is our new developer hub for you to search and explore packages, to understand what is Go good for, to know which companies are using Go and how, and also to know which companies are using third-party libraries and packages so that you can know that they're tested and vetted and secure. So we've come to the end of our 10-year journey.
I forgot one thing, Carmen. Can I just mention this?
Yeah.
Because we're going to have some help with this, and I want to make sure, for those of you that have been patient enough to stay with us, we're nearing the end of our talk.
Yeah.
We have these made for our for our Go meetups around the world. This is a 10th anniversary poster card. It's actually a special image created by the artist who designed the Go Gopher that you see prominently displayed here. It says, "Google wishes Go a happy 10th birthday, and get started with Go by visiting go.dev today." So there's going to be a couple people handing out these postcards if you'd like one. They're a limited thing that we're doing for the Go Turns 10 program. And they also have these special anniversary limited edition Go pins, which has the Easter egg in it is the vines on here have 10 little buds on them representing the 10 years of Go. So, and again, these are things we're only giving out at Go Meetups, but because we love you all so much, we're going to share this with you as well.
Awesome. That was really good. All right. So we don't want to end right now. We want to look into the future. So into the future we go. We love Go puns. All right. First, I want to replace cloud and this new version of the timeline with community. That's you. So the Turkey developer potential is one of the largest in the world. And you have lots of smart and talented people who have, over the next decade, you will shape and influence the tech landscape. And I look forward to coming back in 10 years to tell that story. The community is growing and growing. Van talked about the Go Developer Network that was launched earlier this year. Next year, we want to launch and iterate on go.dev with the Go learning platform. Learning Go today leads to many choices, and we want to make those accessible, and we're going to partner with educational providers and online code sites to curate that Go content for you. And we intend to find ways that the Go Developer Network and the GDG and other networks of developers can learn together in person. Because studies show that the best outcome to learn a language is when you learn in person with a trainer and a cohort that's with you as peers. We also have our beloved gopher with a graduation cap here. This symbolizes two things. The first is graduating up as a contributor. If you'd like to contribute to Go, +2 is our project's word for being able to merge. And the second is seeing Go as a language taught in computer science education. So right now, that's mainly taught in Java. And in the US, Java is the single language exclusively taught at the secondary school level. And that means a generation of graduates are understanding only one paradigm of programming. They're not being introduced to memory management or how the machine works or functional programming. Go is a multi-paradigm language that's easy to learn with a small standard library, and it's perfect to teach in schools. For language and tooling, modules toolchain, once it is adopted en masse by the entire ecosystem, is going to have really special consequences for going to Go too. Because once we can use that at the packaging level, we can keep compatibility and we can prevent. We've learned the lessons from Python 2 versus Python 3 and Perl 5 to Perl 6. When we have the modules toolchain completely matured, then we can call two different major versions in our build file without breaking any compatibility between major versions. I also want to talk about Go in the future with different industry verticals. Right now, people ask me, what is Go good for now? And I say APIs, CLIs, cloud, server-side, programming, networking. But also, Go is going to be big for embedded. When we think of embedded, we really reach for 3 languages today: C, C++, and the newer one called Rust. But there's also, if MicroPython, which is a thing, is gaining traction as a language for embedded, I think Go is a far better candidate. And the work that's being done with this group called TinyGo, with the LLV compiler, is really interesting, and I'm interested to see the future. So there's embedded, but there's also data ops. So Big Slice is built for Go. It's an ordinary Go package, and it can take users' existing Go code and compile it to serverless programs for data processing at scale. Also in the next year or two, I'd like to add Go as a supported language to Jupyter Notebooks. Who has used Jupyter Notebooks here? They are amazing, a fantastic combination of text and code and graphics designed to enhance the way that we convey information for our audience. It has been a killer feature for Python adoption and data science, and I think this is going to be, I can't see why the same cannot be done for Go in the future. I'm also excited to see the growth of Geo for portable graphical user interfaces for Go. So those of you who have been in open source will see that there are some changes afoot. And so as other projects evolve, we want to see what works and what doesn't and evaluate it for Go as an open source programming language. And I didn't put cloud because while there's much to do there, I am particularly interested in seeing Go's place in edge computing, which is predicted to overtake cloud computing in the next decade. But the Go team can't do it alone. We need everyone. So if you want to know the future, you have to create it. I leave you with some final thoughts. I hope you've understood where Go comes from, where it's been, and where it is going. I think that's our 4th Go pun in this talk. Not enough Go puns. But let's build it together. Thank you.